Just before we get into this video, guys, if you want to follow me on social media, on Twitter and Instagram, the links are here. And if you also want to support me on Patreon as well and help out my channel, that would be absolutely awesome as well. But let's get on with the video. I've decided I'm going to go for the castaway look. It's the easiest thing to do in this lockdown. Hey guys, it is Wingy here and welcome to a brand new video. Now, I've done this ranking Doctor Who series before, and it occurred to me that Tom Baker's era alone is long enough to warrant ranking. I need to think about saying that because it's so easily confused with a very, very different word. But of course, as Tom is my favourite Doctor, and within Tom's era of the show, it is my favourite era of the show, so I thought let's talk about his era and rank his seasons from worst to best, purely in my opinion. So if you happen to disagree, well, tough shit. This list was surprisingly easy as well, because I know myself as the Fourth Doctor fanboy that I am. I know what I revisit more and I know what I like. There's a certain period in Tom's era where I just find myself zoning out a little bit, not necessarily because it's bad, it's just I don't enjoy it as much as the rest of it. So without further ado, let's get into it and talk about which season I think is the worst. And that would be season 16, without a shadow of a doubt, which is notable for a number of different reasons. It is the first time that the Doctor travels with a companion who is also a Time Lord in Romana, and it is also the first time in Doctor Who's history that we had a story arc, which of course is the Key to Time arc. Now, the problem with this season is, one, the overarching story of the Key to Time is pointless. It goes absolutely nowhere. They basically just get all the pieces of the Key to Time and then they get rid of it again. Surely if you wanted to build an arc, you would make it mean something by the end of it, but they don't. Now, it's not necessarily just the overarching story plot that is going on that makes this season Tom's weakest. For me, I just don't enjoy the stories as much. Don't get me wrong, there are a few standout stories in this season, but overall I think this is a pretty weak season. It is the peak Graham Williams era for me, and I know some people are going to argue that possibly season 17 deserves to be here ahead, but there's a very specific reason as to why I've put season 16 in last place. For me, stories like The Power of Kroll and the Ribos operation are just boring. They are just so dull and bland, and they are stories that I personally struggle to watch, and I will probably, unless I'm doing a full-on rewatch of either the classic era or Tom's era, I'm probably never going to watch again. Ribos Operation is probably one of Robert Holmes' weakest scripts. I think he wrote that one. It was Robert Holmes who wrote that, wasn't it? I'm sure it was. But the frustrating thing is, in season 16 you also have stuff like The Pirate Planet, which is, I think, a really good story, as well as The Stones of Blood, which I think is underrated. Mary Tam does a fine job as Romana, but for me, I always associate Romana with Lalla Ward, so while she is good, I don't find her as memorable as Lalla Ward's performance. Speaking of, we're going to go with season 17 now, because obviously that is a season that arguably could have been last, and for a lot of people it definitely is, and I understand why, because I definitely think that the overall quality of season 17 is worse. However, I would say that anything in season 16 is not as good as City of Death, and that story alone has saved it from being in last place for me. Plus the Shada as well, which is obviously part of season 17, but technically isn't, because it wasn't finished, but it was finished like a couple of years ago into an animated story, so I'm going to count it because it is part of it, right? The highs of City of Death, I think, are higher than anything in season 16. In fact, it's higher than a lot of Tom Baker's era. It's one of the best Doctor Who stories ever made. However, I'm not going to deny that stories such as Destiny of the Daleks are a bit naff. Stories like Creature from the Pit are not that good. I must admit, I do actually have a soft spot for Nightmare of Eden. I think that is such an underrated story with a brilliant script that is hampered so badly by production value that people just rail on it. But for me, I think it's one of the best stories of the season, and in fact the Graham Williams era. But apart from that, there isn't too much to say about season 17. Tom is totally off the wall at this point. he's just not being handled by anybody. He's totally going off on one and doing weird goofy stuff with the part. Lala Ward is a nice breath of fresh air, and I like her dynamic with Tom. Like I said previously, I prefer her portrayal of Romana, and like I say, City of Death is what has saved this, because that is easily a 9.5 out of 10 story. It's phenomenal. Going into 5th place then, and I feel bad because it's the Graham Williams era which makes up the bottom 3, but I'm gonna have to go with season 15. Now season 15 for me is easily the best of the Graham Williams era. Obviously why it's ahead of 16 and 17, but there's something about it that just makes me not revisit it as much. I think there's some fantastic stories in there, like Horror of Fang Rock. Image of the Fendal is a decent story. I know a lot of people like the Sunmakers, but I'm not massive on it. But then you also have stuff like Underworld, which is fucking terrible. It's a bit of a mixed bag season, but I think because the direction had clearly shifted from the Hinchcliffe and Holmes era, there's something a bit off with this season, and I can't figure out what it is. It almost feels as if like the spirit or the ethos or I don't know, the main bare bones of the Tom Baker era just aren't there anymore. I think one thing that made Tom's Doctor so special was seeing his wide-eyed, toothy grin approach, but in a really dark, gothic story. I think that contrast worked really well, and in the Graham Williams era you don't really get that, and I think I notice it more in season 15 because it comes directly after the Hinchcliffe and Holmes era. It is a gradual transition. Stories like Horror of Fang Rock and Image of the Fendal, they definitely feel like something that would easily slip in to the previous regime, but for me it's still not amazing. Plus Leela's exit is a bunch of bullshit in Invasion of Time, I've got to admit. As much as I like the story, probably more than most people do, and the character of Leela definitely deserve better. So we've reached the halfway point, 4th best or 4th worst, however you want to word it. I'm going to go with season 18. Now season 18 is such a drastic shift, more so than the Graham Williams era. This was Doctor Who for the 1980s, and to be fair, the only thing really that seems out of place in season 18 is Tom. Everything about this era screams of Peter Davison, or at least what we would subsequently get in the Peter Davison era. This was sort of the basic template for a Peter Davison season, but still with Tom Baker. I really like the approach. I like the more moody and somber version of Tom. It probably wasn't intended, however, because of behind the scenes reasons, that was always going to happen because of Tom's nature as a person. I really like the feel and the vibe of season 18. I really love Tom's new look. I love the new incidental music. I love the theme music. I love the more scientific approach, not just scientific gobbledygook like in previous eras. I mean, you still get that, but less so. I love the return of the Master, and I think the E-Space trilogy is a nice way to end out Romana's story arc as a companion. And believe it or not, I actually quite like Adric in this season. I think he works a hell of a lot better with Tom than he did with Peter Davison, which is ironic given stuff behind the scenes. Legopolis being Tom's last story, I love it and hate it, because one, Tom leaves, so I hate it, but at the same time I love it because it's such an enjoyable story for me. I have such nostalgia towards Legopolis. The only problem is, kind of like what I was saying before, it's a Davison story, and it's so weird that Tom Baker's era started with essentially a Pertwee story and it ended with essentially a Peter Davison story. Most Doctors get a story that defines their era for when they start and when they leave, but Tom definitely didn't. Did I mention Tom's costume in the season? I need to mention it again if I haven't, because it's fucking beautiful. So, 3rd place then. Now this one was slightly difficult because it's obviously going to be part of the golden era of Doctor Who, the Hinchcliffe and the Robert Holmes era of Doctor Who. Initially I'm going to go with season 14, and that is because I think out of the 3 seasons that is the weakest. I also don't like a couple of the stories. Mask of Mandragora is something that I've ripped apart on this channel before. I really find it boring and forgettable. Sarah Jane obviously leaves in this season as well, in what is my favourite story of all time, The Hand of Fear. Absolute classic stories in this, such as The Robots of Death and The Talons of Weng Chiang, which might be a controversial story now, but it's still an enjoyable story. You've also got The Deadly Assassin, which again is a controversial one in terms of Time Lord lore and mythology. I mean, why would they mess with Time Lord lore and mythology? That'd just be stupid. Again, you've got The Return of the Master, and you've also got The Face of Evil, which I think is a brilliant introduction to Leela, and I think Tom shines in that story. So whilst it's a strong season, I just think that we had better in Tom's first 2. I mean, if the other 2 are 9s or 10s, this is an 8. easily, and it's probably only Mask of Mandragora that's bringing it down somewhat. So, it's obviously season 12 or it's season 13. Now, if you've watched my channel for a while, then you probably will know what the answer is already. However, for those of you who don't know, my favourite season of all time is going to be number 1. So, in second place, it's season 12. Tom Baker's first season as the Doctor, which is, well, brilliant. It's a brilliant season of Doctor Who. I don't think that there's a single truly awful story in there. I think Revenge of the Cybermen is probably the weakest story of the season. But even then, having rewatched it not so long ago, it's actually not that bad. The only thing that's bad about it, really, is the Cybermen, who are a bit crap. You've got an all-time classic in this season, in Genesis of the Daleks. I don't think I need to speak about that, you guys should know about it already. Phenomenal story. But then again, you've also got the likes of The Ark in Space, which is another phenomenal Doctor Who story. You've got the Sontaran Experiment, which is unique in the sense that it's only a 2-part story. They didn't happen that often during this time. And that is a brilliant little story featuring the Sontarans and Sarah Jane and Harry, and it's just a fun little runaround. You've also got Robot, which, whilst it is essentially a John Pertwee story, it emphasises how different this Doctor is to his previous incarnation. And it's nice seeing a brand new Doctor interact with the likes of the Brigadier and driving around in Bessie and working with Unit. Obviously we wouldn't get to see a lot of that during Tom's era, but it's still nice to see. Tom took to the role like a duck to water. Like, the guy himself is fucking mental. I personally think that season 13 is not only Tom's best, but the best season of Doctor Who ever. Season 13 for me is not a bad season at all. There is not a single story within it that I find myself actively disliking. For me, the weakest story would probably be Planet of Evil, but even then it's actually a pretty good story. The Brain of Morbius I've never been fond of, even less so now, but again, that's still a really good story. Starts off with Terror of the Zygons, which feels like another season 12 story. It originally was supposed to be another season 12 story, but it got pushed back. But it's still nice seeing Harry and the Brigadier again, and obviously Harry leaves at the end of this story, which is a bit sad, but you don't really care because the Zygons are awesome. You've got the Seeds of Doom, which is a 6-part epic story, which is just fucking brilliant. You've got the Android Invasion, which I think is an underrated gem of a Doctor Who story. It's absolutely brilliant. I just love stuff with robots or things taking over us and replacing us. I find that stuff fascinating. And how could you not talk about this season without talking about Pyramids of Mars, which introduces what is arguably the most iconic one-off Doctor Who villain that we have ever had in the form of Sutekh. And Tom Baker's performance throughout this entire thing is one of his best that he ever put in as the Doctor. I always want to revisit this season, and I think that for me is the key to why I love it so much, and I would say it's the best ever, not just in Tom's era. And I guess that's what you want. You know, if you enjoy something, you want to keep coming back to it. I don't feel as strongly towards any other season as I do this one. I will always find an excuse if I want to watch a Doctor Who story to pick one of these. Typically the Android Invasion is like the easy-going watch one. Seeds of Doom is the one that I have to really invest in, probably because it's the longest one. Planet of Evil I probably come to the least because it's my least favourite, but I still really like it. And for me, this is the epitome of not only Tom Baker's Doctor, but the perfect Doctor companion relationship. I think Elizabeth Sladen needs a hell of a lot more credit because she is brilliant in this season. Her chemistry with Tom is absolutely phenomenal. You literally can't write another TARDIS team as good as these two. There's others that come close, don't get me wrong, like Troughton and Jamie, Joe and the Third Doctor, David Tennant and Donna, but for me this is the ultimate version of Doctor Who. It never got better than this. But in the comments below, guys, let me know what you think of the Tom Baker era. Do you agree with my choices? If not, how would you rank the Tom Baker era of Doctor Who? If you enjoyed this video, make sure you leave a like on it, subscribe for more. Social media and Patreon links will be in the description below, as always. So if you would follow me on any of those things, I would absolutely love you forever. But till next time, guys, you really take care of yourselves, stay safe, and I will see you all in the next one. Goodbye.
Who does that arsehole even think he is, ranking my era of the show like he even knows anything? Never mind, Doctor. Let's do something else to take your mind off of it. 21st century Earth. That seems like a phenomenal time period to go through right now. I wonder if they ever tried your bat soup.